The war did not begin with a single explosion or a sudden roar of guns across Europe. It began quietly, with tension that had been building for decades, with alliances formed in fear, with rival empires watching one another closely, and with millions of ordinary people unaware that their lives were about to be consumed by the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. By the summer of 1914, Europe stood like a tightly wound spring. One small spark was enough to unleash forces that no government would be able to control. In the early years of the 20th century, Europe was dominated by powerful empires. Britain ruled the seas and possessed a vast global empire. France, still haunted by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War decades earlier, longed for security and revenge. Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, sought recognition as a great world power. Austria-Hungary struggled to hold together a fragile mix of nationalities. Russia looked westward, claiming to protect Slavic peoples while pursuing its own ambitions. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty, was slowly weakening, its territories eyed by rivals. These powers were bound together by a complex web of alliances. Germany and Austria-Hungary stood together. France and Russia formed their own pact. Britain, though cautious, aligned itself with France and Russia in what became known as the Entente. Each alliance promised protection, but in reality, they ensured that any local conflict could rapidly become a continental war. Nationalism intensified these dangers. Across Europe, people identified strongly with their nation, their language, and their culture. In some places, this pride fueled unity. In others, especially within multinational empires like Austria-Hungary, it created deep unrest. Nowhere was this more dangerous than in the Balkans, a region often described as the powder keg of Europe. There, ethnic groups sought independence, and rival powers competed for influence. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, a young nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife. The act itself was shocking but not unprecedented. Political violence had occurred before. What made this moment different was how governments responded. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding sweeping concessions. Serbia accepted most of the demands but resisted complete submission. Austria-Hungary declared war. The alliance system immediately began to work as designed, but with catastrophic consequences. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. Germany's war plan required a swift strike through Belgium to reach Paris. Belgium was neutral, but Germany invaded anyway. Britain, bound by treaty to protect Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in conflict. What many believed would be a short and decisive war quickly turned into something far more destructive. Millions of men were mobilized. Trains carried soldiers to the front, cheered by crowds who believed they would return victorious by Christmas. Few understood what modern industrial warfare would bring. By late 1914, the Western Front had formed. Stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, opposing armies dug into the earth. Trenches became the defining feature of the war. Soldiers lived in mud, surrounded by rats, lice, and constant danger. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a killing ground swept by machine gun fire and artillery. The technology of war had advanced faster than military strategy. Machine guns could mow down attacking infantry in seconds. Heavy artillery bombarded positions day and night. Poison gas drifted across battlefields, choking and blinding its victims. Yet generals continued to order frontal assaults, believing that courage and numbers could overcome firepower. The result was slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Battles like those at the Marne, Ypres, and Verdun became symbols of the war's brutality. Hundreds of thousands of men were killed or wounded for minimal territorial gain. Entire villages were erased. The landscape itself was transformed into a shattered wasteland of craters and broken trees. On the Eastern Front, the fighting was more fluid but no less deadly. Germany and Austria-Hungary battled Russia across vast distances. While there were dramatic advances and retreats, the cost in human lives remained staggering. Poor infrastructure, harsh weather, and shortages of supplies worsened conditions for soldiers and civilians alike. As the war dragged on into 1915 and 1916, it became clear that neither side could achieve a quick victory. The conflict had become a war of attrition. Each side sought to wear down the other by inflicting greater losses. Industrial capacity became as important as battlefield success. Factories worked around the clock producing shells, rifles, and uniforms. Entire economies were reorganized for total war. Civilians were no longer distant from the fighting. Cities were shelled. Food shortages became common. Governments introduced rationing. Women entered factories in large numbers, replacing men who had gone to the front. Societies were transformed as the demands of war touched every aspect of daily life. By 1916, the human cost was almost unimaginable. Millions were dead or wounded. Entire generations of young men were being lost. Morale began to falter. Soldiers questioned the purpose of endless attacks that gained nothing. Civilians grew weary of sacrifice with no clear end in sight. The great offensives of 1916, including the battle at Verdun and the Somme, epitomized the stalemate. At Verdun, French and German forces fought for nearly a year over a small area of land. The goal was not victory but exhaustion. At the Somme, British and French forces launched a massive assault. On the first day alone, tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded. By the end of the campaign, the front line had barely moved. By the end of 1916, Europe was bleeding. The major powers were financially strained, their armies exhausted, their populations growing restless. The promise of quick victory had vanished. Instead, leaders faced the grim reality of a long, grinding struggle with no clear solution. It was in this desperate context that the war began to look beyond Europe for salvation. Fresh resources, fresh soldiers, and renewed morale were desperately needed. Across the Atlantic Ocean stood a nation that had, so far, remained outside the conflict. Industrially powerful, economically strong, and untouched by the devastation of war, the United States watched events unfold with growing concern. Though still neutral, America was no longer distant from the war's effects. Trade, diplomacy, and public opinion were increasingly influenced by events overseas. As Europe descended deeper into exhaustion and despair, the balance of the conflict began to depend on forces beyond its borders. The war that began as a European struggle was slowly becoming something larger. And as 1916 came to a close, the fate of the conflict would soon hinge on whether a powerful new nation would remain on the sidelines or step into the storm. Across the Atlantic, the United States observed the war with a mixture of concern, distance, and restraint. When fighting erupted in Europe in 1914, America was a nation shaped by a long tradition of avoiding entanglement in foreign wars. For many Americans, the conflict seemed remote, rooted in old rivalries and disputes that had little to do with life in the United States. The Atlantic Ocean felt wide enough to keep Europe's problems at bay. President Woodrow Wilson declared that the United States would remain neutral in thought as well as in action. His words reflected the mood of much of the nation. Americans came from many backgrounds, and millions were recent immigrants from Europe. Some had family ties to Britain and France, others to Germany or Austria-Hungary. Taking sides risked dividing the country at a time when unity was essential. Neutrality also made sense economically and politically. The United States was prospering. Its factories produced goods for domestic use and for export. American banks and businesses traded with many nations, including those at war. Remaining neutral allowed commerce to continue and avoided the immense costs of military involvement. Many believed that America could serve as a mediator, helping bring the war to a peaceful end. Yet neutrality was never as simple as it appeared. While the United States claimed impartiality, economic realities pushed it closer to one side. The British Navy controlled the seas, making trade with Germany increasingly difficult. American exports to Britain and France soared, while trade with the Central Powers dwindled. American banks extended large loans to the Allies, tying U.S. financial interests to their survival. Public opinion, though divided, gradually began to shift. Reports of German actions in Belgium, including the destruction of towns and the suffering of civilians, were widely circulated in American newspapers. These stories, often vivid and emotional, shaped perceptions of the war. Britain's control of transatlantic communication meant that much of the news reaching the United States came through Allied sources. Still, powerful voices argued against involvement. Many Americans believed the war was a tragic mistake driven by imperial ambition. Others feared that intervention would cost countless American lives for causes that were not truly America's own. Pacifist movements gained attention, and isolationist sentiment remained strong in Congress and among the public. President Wilson faced a difficult balancing act. He sought to protect American rights and interests without provoking war. One of the greatest challenges came from the war at sea. Britain imposed a blockade on Germany, restricting neutral trade. Germany responded with submarine warfare, using U-boats to target enemy shipping. These submarines threatened not only military vessels but also merchant ships, including those of neutral nations. In May 1915, a German submarine sank the British passenger liner Lusitania. Among the nearly 1,200 people who died were American citizens. The news shocked the United States. Newspapers printed images of the wreckage and lists of the dead. Public anger surged, and calls for action grew louder. Germany defended its actions by arguing that the ship carried military supplies. The debate over responsibility was fierce, but the emotional impact was undeniable. For many Americans, the sinking of the Lusitania symbolized the dangers of remaining neutral in a world at war. Wilson responded with firm diplomatic protests rather than military action. He demanded that Germany respect the rights of neutral nations and protect civilian lives. Germany, hoping to avoid drawing the United States into the war, agreed to limit its submarine attacks. For a time, tension eased. The election of 1916 approached amid uncertainty. Wilson campaigned on the promise that he had kept America out of war. That message resonated with voters weary of conflict. He won re-election narrowly, a sign of how deeply divided the nation remained. Yet even as Americans voted for peace, the situation in Europe worsened. The war dragged on with no clear end. Casualties mounted. The Allied powers grew increasingly desperate for relief. Germany, facing shortages and a tightening blockade, reconsidered its strategy. In early 1917, German leaders made a fateful decision. They announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats would once again attack ships in the war zone without warning, including those of neutral nations. Germany believed this gamble could starve Britain into submission before the United States could mobilize. The decision placed American neutrality under severe strain. Within weeks, American merchant ships were sunk. Sailors were killed. The Atlantic became a dangerous battlefield, and the safety of American lives and commerce was no longer assured. At the same time, a new diplomatic crisis emerged. British intelligence intercepted a secret German message sent to Mexico. In it, Germany proposed an alliance against the United States, promising support for Mexico to regain lost territories if America entered the war. When the contents of the message became public, outrage swept across the nation. For many Americans, these events marked a turning point. The idea that the war could remain distant and contained no longer seemed credible. Germany's actions appeared to challenge American sovereignty and security directly. President Wilson now faced the decision he had long sought to avoid. The question was no longer whether America wished to enter the war, but whether it could afford not to. Neutrality, once a position of safety and principle, increasingly looked like vulnerability. As debates intensified, Wilson reframed the conflict in moral terms. He argued that the war was no longer just about European rivalries, but about the defense of democratic values and international law. The world, he suggested, must be made safe for democracy. Across the United States, attitudes continued to shift. Preparedness movements called for strengthening the military. Industries began to consider what full mobilization might require. The nation stood at a crossroads, pulled between its past commitment to neutrality and the growing realization that global events could no longer be ignored. By the spring of 1917, the forces pushing America toward war had become overwhelming. Economic ties, diplomatic crises, and repeated attacks on American shipping combined to erode resistance to intervention. What had once seemed unthinkable was now increasingly accepted as necessary. The United States had not yet entered the war, but neutrality was collapsing. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly. Soon, America would have to choose whether to remain a spectator to history or become an active participant in shaping its outcome. In early April of 1917, Washington was tense and uncertain. The capital, usually measured and formal, now carried the weight of an approaching decision that would alter the course of history. President Woodrow Wilson had spent years trying to keep the United States out of the European war, believing that America could act as a neutral force for peace. Now, the events of the previous months had left him with little room to maneuver. German submarines continued to sink ships in the Atlantic. American sailors had been killed. Commerce was under constant threat. The promise Germany had once made to restrict submarine warfare was gone. At the same time, the revelation of the German proposal to Mexico had shaken public confidence. The idea that a foreign power was actively encouraging war against the United States struck many Americans as a direct insult and a clear danger. Wilson knew that entering the war would bring immense sacrifice. He also knew that continued inaction risked making the United States appear weak and powerless. After weeks of careful consideration, he decided that the time for neutrality had passed. On April 2, 1917, Wilson appeared before a special session of Congress. The chamber was filled with lawmakers, journalists, and observers who sensed the gravity of the moment. Wilson spoke calmly, deliberately, and without theatrical language. He did not call for revenge or conquest. Instead, he framed the decision as a matter of principle. He described Germany's actions at sea as a war against all nations, not just against specific enemies. He argued that unrestricted submarine warfare violated international law and threatened the freedom of the seas. Neutral rights, he said, had been trampled. American lives had been taken without warning or justification. Wilson then moved beyond immediate grievances. He spoke of a broader purpose. The war, he declared, was about more than territory or power. It was about the kind of world that would emerge once the fighting ended. He stated that the United States must fight not for material gain, but to defend democracy and establish a just and lasting peace. His words echoed through the chamber. Some members of Congress listened in silence. Others nodded in agreement. A few remained skeptical, concerned about the cost in lives and resources. Debate followed, as it must in a democratic system, but the momentum was clear. The nation was moving toward war. On April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare war on Germany. The United States was now officially a participant in the greatest conflict the world had ever known. The declaration marked a profound shift in American history. For the first time, the United States committed itself to a large-scale war on European soil. The decision was met with a mix of reactions across the country. In many cities, crowds gathered to show support, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. In other places, the mood was somber. Families understood that sons, brothers, and husbands would soon be sent across the ocean to fight and possibly die. The federal government moved quickly to prepare the nation for war. America's military at the time was relatively small. Compared to the massive armies already fighting in Europe, the United States was unprepared for immediate large-scale combat. Mobilization would be a colossal task. Congress passed laws to expand the armed forces. A system of selective service was introduced to raise an army through conscription. Young men across the country registered for the draft. Training camps were established almost overnight. Fields, fairgrounds, and open land were transformed into military bases filled with new recruits. Industry was mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted to manufacture weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and vehicles. Railroads were placed under federal control to ensure efficient transportation of troops and supplies. Shipyards worked relentlessly to build vessels capable of carrying soldiers and cargo across submarine-infested waters. The war effort required unity and discipline. The government launched extensive campaigns to shape public opinion and encourage support for the war. Posters, films, and speeches promoted patriotism and sacrifice. Citizens were urged to buy war bonds, conserve food, and contribute in any way they could. At the same time, fear and suspicion spread. Immigrants from Germany and other Central Powers faced discrimination and hostility. Dissenting voices were often labeled unpatriotic. Laws were passed that restricted criticism of the government and the war effort. The balance between national security and civil liberties became a source of tension that would linger long after the war ended. As America prepared to fight, the situation in Europe grew increasingly dire. Allied armies were exhausted. Years of trench warfare had drained their strength. Mutinies and strikes revealed deep cracks in morale. Germany, though strained by blockade and loss, still held strong defensive positions. The arrival of American support offered hope. Allied leaders understood that while American troops would take time to train and deploy, their sheer numbers and fresh energy could change the balance of the war. The knowledge that millions of new soldiers would eventually join the fight lifted spirits on the Western Front. Yet the challenge ahead was immense. American soldiers would have to cross the Atlantic safely, train for a kind of warfare they had never experienced, and face a seasoned enemy. There would be no quick victory. The cost would be high. As the first contingents of American troops began to assemble and prepare for departure, the United States entered a new phase of its national story. The country had moved from cautious observer to committed participant. The decision made in April 1917 would reshape not only the outcome of the war, but also America's role in the world. The turning point had arrived. The United States was now at war, and the path ahead would demand endurance, sacrifice, and resolve on a scale the nation had never known. The declaration of war did not mean that American soldiers could immediately influence the fighting. In April of 1917, the United States possessed determination and resources, but it lacked experience in modern industrial warfare. The armies of Europe had been fighting continuously for nearly 3 years. They had learned, at terrible cost, how to survive in trenches under constant artillery fire. American forces would have to learn these lessons quickly. At the center of America's military effort stood a professional corps that was small but disciplined. The regular army and the National Guard together numbered only a fraction of the forces already engaged overseas. To transform this foundation into a modern fighting force capable of operating on the Western Front required organization, leadership, and time. Training camps expanded across the country. Young men arrived by the thousands, many leaving their homes for the first time. They were issued uniforms, drilled relentlessly, and taught the basics of soldiering. Officers worked to instill discipline and confidence, knowing that these recruits would soon face conditions unlike anything they had imagined. The challenge extended beyond manpower. Weapons, artillery, vehicles, and aircraft had to be produced in enormous quantities. American industry responded with remarkable speed. Assembly lines were adapted. Production schedules were intensified. The nation's industrial strength, largely untouched by war damage, became a decisive advantage. Transporting troops to Europe posed another critical problem. German submarines still prowled the Atlantic, threatening ships carrying men and supplies. To counter this danger, the Allies developed convoy systems, escorting transports with warships. The United States Navy expanded rapidly, contributing destroyers and patrol vessels to protect vital sea lanes. As preparations continued, American leaders debated how their forces should be used. European commanders, desperate for immediate reinforcements, wanted American soldiers sent to the front as quickly as possible, even if they were integrated into existing Allied units. American leadership, however, insisted on maintaining an independent army. They believed that the United States should fight under its own command, preserving national identity and political influence. This decision led to the creation of the American Expeditionary Forces. Its commander was General John J. Pershing, a career officer with a reputation for discipline and independence. Pershing was determined that American troops would not simply fill gaps in Allied lines. He insisted they would fight as a unified force when properly trained and equipped. Pershing arrived in Europe in June 1917. His presence symbolized America's commitment, even though most American troops were still months away from combat readiness. European leaders welcomed him warmly, aware that the future of the war might depend on the forces he would eventually command. As American units began arriving in France, they were greeted by cheering crowds. To war-weary civilians and soldiers alike, the sight of fresh troops marching through French ports offered renewed hope. These Americans appeared confident and energetic, untouched by years of trench warfare. Their arrival sent a powerful message to both allies and enemies. Despite the optimism, reality soon asserted itself. American soldiers had to adapt to unfamiliar conditions. Trenches were muddy, crowded, and dangerous. Artillery fire could strike without warning. Gas masks became essential equipment. Training intensified as American officers worked to prepare their men for the brutal demands of modern combat. Throughout late 1917, American involvement remained limited. Small units were gradually introduced to the front, often alongside French and British troops. These early engagements were carefully managed, allowing Americans to gain experience while minimizing losses. Each encounter brought lessons that would prove critical in the months ahead. Meanwhile, the broader war continued to strain the Allied cause. In Russia, political upheaval led to revolution and eventual withdrawal from the conflict. This development allowed Germany to transfer troops from the Eastern Front to the West, increasing pressure on Allied lines. The balance of power hung in the balance. Germany launched a final, desperate effort to win the war before American strength could fully assert itself. In the spring of 1918, German forces initiated a series of massive offensives along the Western Front. Using new tactics that emphasized speed and surprise, they broke through Allied positions and advanced toward key objectives. For a moment, it seemed as though the gamble might succeed. Allied forces were pushed back. Casualties mounted. The situation grew critical. It was at this moment, when the war appeared to teeter on the edge of collapse, that American troops began to play a more decisive role. American units were rushed to reinforce threatened sectors. Though still learning, they fought with determination. Their presence stiffened Allied defenses. Fresh manpower helped fill gaps that had formed under relentless German pressure. As the summer of 1918 approached, the tide began to turn. American forces grew in number and confidence. Training improved. Coordination with Allied units strengthened. The United States was no longer merely a source of future promise. It had become an active force on the battlefield. The war that had once seemed distant now demanded everything America could give. The nation's entry had not brought instant victory, but it had altered the trajectory of the conflict. With each passing month, the balance shifted further away from exhaustion and toward renewed strength. What lay ahead would be the most intense phase of the war. The sacrifices required would be severe. Yet the arrival of American power, both industrial and human, had changed the calculation. The question was no longer whether the Allies could survive, but whether they could now press forward and end the war. The moment that began in neutrality had evolved into full commitment. The turning of the tide was underway, and the final outcome of the conflict would soon be decided. By the summer of 1918, the character of the war began to change in visible and decisive ways. For nearly 4 years, the Western Front had been defined by stalemate, exhaustion, and despair. Now, for the first time, momentum slowly shifted. The arrival of large numbers of American troops gave the Allies something they had not possessed in years: the ability to plan offensives with confidence that losses could be replaced and pressure sustained. American soldiers continued to arrive in France at an astonishing rate. By mid-1918, hundreds of thousands were crossing the Atlantic each month. Camps expanded, supply lines grew more efficient, and coordination between Allied forces improved. What had once been a promise was becoming reality. The American expeditionary forces were no longer a future asset. They were now a decisive presence. German commanders understood the danger clearly. Every month that passed strengthened the Allies and weakened Germany's chances. The spring offensives had failed to deliver victory. German troops were exhausted, supply shortages worsened, and morale declined. The blockade tightened its grip, starving the German economy of vital resources. Time was no longer on Germany's side. In this critical moment, Allied commanders prepared their response. The strategy was no longer to launch single, massive assaults that bled armies dry. Instead, they planned coordinated attacks using infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft together. Warfare was evolving, and American forces were part of that transformation. One of the first major tests for American troops came at the Battle of Cantigny in May 1918. Though limited in scale, the battle carried great symbolic weight. American soldiers attacked, captured, and held their objective against determined German counterattacks. The success demonstrated that American troops could fight effectively on the Western Front. Soon after, American forces faced even greater challenges. At Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood, U.S. Marines and Army units fought fiercely to halt the German advance toward Paris. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. Dense forests, machine gun nests, and relentless artillery fire tested the endurance of inexperienced troops. At Belleau Wood, American forces launched repeated assaults against entrenched German positions. Casualties were heavy. Progress was slow. Yet the Americans refused to withdraw. Their determination impressed both allies and enemies. When the fighting finally ended, the German advance had been stopped. The threat to Paris receded. These battles marked a psychological turning point. Allied confidence grew as American units proved their resilience under fire. German forces, accustomed to facing exhausted opponents, now encountered fresh troops willing to absorb losses and continue attacking. The dynamic of the war began to shift. As summer turned to autumn, the Allies prepared for a series of coordinated offensives designed to break the stalemate permanently. The plan was ambitious. Attacks would be launched along multiple sectors of the front, denying Germany the ability to concentrate its forces. American troops would play a central role in these operations. In September 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces undertook their first major independent offensive at Saint-Mihiel. The objective was to eliminate a German salient that had threatened Allied positions for years. Under Pershing's command, American forces attacked with overwhelming strength. Supported by French units and coordinated artillery, the offensive achieved rapid success. Within days, the salient was eliminated. Thousands of German prisoners were taken. The victory boosted American confidence and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated modern warfare. It also confirmed that the American Army had matured into a capable fighting force. Almost immediately, attention turned to an even larger operation. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would become the largest battle fought by American forces in the war. It was also one of the most complex and demanding. The terrain was difficult, filled with forests, hills, and fortified German positions. The enemy was determined and well entrenched. Beginning in late September 1918, American troops advanced under heavy fire. Progress was slow and costly. Communication challenges, logistical difficulties, and fierce resistance tested commanders and soldiers alike. Yet the offensive did not stop. Day after day, American units pressed forward. The scale of the fighting was immense. Millions of men were involved. Artillery thundered constantly. Supply lines stretched to their limits. Medical services struggled to cope with the wounded. Despite these hardships, American forces continued their advance, gradually pushing German troops back. The pressure was relentless. Allied attacks along the front forced Germany to retreat from positions it had held for years. Rail lines were disrupted. Supply depots were lost. German commanders recognized that their army could no longer sustain the fight. Inside Germany, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages worsened. Civil unrest spread. Confidence in leadership collapsed. Allies of Germany began to seek peace independently. One by one, the Central Powers fell away. By early November 1918, the outcome was no longer in doubt. German forces were retreating across the front. Their defenses were breaking. The prospect of continued resistance promised only further destruction with no hope of victory. On the morning of November 11, 1918, an armistice took effect. The guns fell silent. After more than 4 years of relentless warfare, the fighting stopped. Soldiers emerged from trenches in disbelief. The war that had consumed their lives had finally ended. For the United States, the war had lasted only 19 months, but its impact was profound. More than 100,000 Americans had died. Millions had served. The nation had mobilized its economy, transformed its military, and asserted itself on the world stage. America's entry into the war had not simply added numbers to the Allied cause. It had changed the balance of power. Fresh troops, industrial strength, and renewed morale had tipped the scales at a moment when defeat seemed possible. The tide had turned, and history had followed. As peace negotiations began, the world faced the challenge of shaping a future after unprecedented destruction. The United States, once a distant observer, now stood at the center of global affairs. Its role in ending the war would define its place in the century to come. The silence that followed the armistice felt unreal. For years, the world had been filled with the constant thunder of artillery, the crack of rifle fire, and the low rumble of explosions that never truly ceased. Now, across the Western Front, men stood still, listening to a quiet they scarcely recognized. Some wept openly. Others sat in exhaustion, unsure how to respond to the sudden end of violence. The war had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. Europe lay shattered. Cities were damaged, farmland destroyed, railways broken, and entire regions left scarred by years of fighting. Millions of soldiers returned home wounded in body or mind. Families mourned losses that could never be replaced. The social and political fabric of nations had been stretched to the breaking point. For the United States, victory brought both pride and responsibility. American troops began the long journey home, greeted by cheering crowds and public celebrations. Parades filled city streets. Uniforms became symbols of sacrifice and service. Yet beneath the celebration lay a deeper awareness of what the war had demanded and what it had changed. America had entered the conflict as a reluctant participant. It emerged as a decisive force in global affairs. Its economy had expanded dramatically during the war. Its military had grown into a modern fighting force capable of operating overseas. Its voice now carried weight in discussions about the future of the world. President Woodrow Wilson believed that the war must lead to a new international order. He argued that peace should not be built on punishment or revenge, but on cooperation and mutual security. His vision centered on the idea that future wars could be prevented through collective responsibility and open diplomacy. Wilson traveled to Europe to participate directly in peace negotiations, a rare step for an American president at the time. His presence underscored the new role the United States played on the world stage. European leaders welcomed American involvement, though not all shared Wilson's idealism. The peace talks culminated in the Treaty of Versailles. The agreement formally ended the war between the Allies and Germany. It imposed significant territorial losses, military restrictions, and economic reparations on Germany. Supporters argued that these measures were necessary to prevent future aggression. Critics warned that the treaty was too harsh and would sow resentment. The United States faced its own debate over the post-war settlement. Wilson urged the nation to support the treaty and join a new international organization designed to preserve peace. He believed that American participation was essential to prevent another global conflict. However, opposition grew at home. Many Americans feared that joining international commitments would entangle the nation in future wars. Others objected to specific terms of the treaty or questioned whether European rivalries could truly be resolved through agreements. The debate was intense and deeply political. In the end, the United States Senate rejected the treaty and declined to join the new international organization. America signed a separate peace and turned inward once more. The decision reflected enduring isolationist sentiment and concern about foreign entanglements. Despite this withdrawal, the impact of America's entry into the war could not be undone. The United States had demonstrated that it possessed the capacity to mobilize on a global scale. Its intervention had altered the outcome of the conflict at a critical moment. Allies had been saved from collapse. Germany's final gamble had failed. The war also left lasting marks on American society. Veterans returned with new perspectives shaped by their experiences overseas. Women, who had taken on expanded roles during the war, pressed for greater recognition and rights. African American soldiers, who had served with distinction despite facing discrimination at home, returned determined to demand change. Economically, the United States emerged stronger than any European power. While others struggled to rebuild, American industry expanded. Financial influence shifted across the Atlantic. The balance of global power was changing, even if Americans did not fully acknowledge it at the time. Yet the war's legacy was complex and uneasy. The peace proved fragile. Many of the problems that had led to conflict remained unresolved. National grievances persisted. Economic hardship and political instability spread across parts of Europe. The hope that the war had been the one to end all wars would soon be tested. Looking back, America's entry into World War I stands as a defining moment. It marked the transition from regional power to global actor. It showed how industrial strength, combined with manpower and resolve, could shape the fate of nations. It also revealed the limits of idealism in a world still driven by rivalry and fear. The decision to enter the war was not inevitable, nor was it simple. It was shaped by economic ties, political values, and direct challenges to American security. When the moment came, the United States chose to act, and that choice altered the course of history. The war ended, but the world it left behind was forever changed. The trenches were silent, but their lessons endured. America had stepped onto the world stage, and there would be no returning to the distance of the past. The turning of the tide in 1917 had carried the nation into a new era, one filled with both promise and responsibility. Even after the celebrations faded and soldiers returned home, the shadow of the war lingered over the United States and the world. World War I had not only reshaped borders and governments, it had altered how nations understood power, security, and responsibility. For America, the experience marked a profound transformation that would influence every major decision of the 20th century. Before 1917, the United States had largely viewed global conflicts as distant events. Oceans provided safety, and history encouraged caution. After the war, that sense of separation was gone. American leaders had seen how events overseas could threaten national interests, commerce, and security. The idea that the United States could remain permanently detached from global affairs no longer matched reality. The American military, once small and regionally focused, had become a modern force capable of operating across continents. Lessons learned in France shaped military planning for decades. Training, logistics, coordination between land, sea, and air forces, and the importance of industrial support all became permanent features of American strategy. The war had exposed weaknesses, but it had also accelerated learning at an extraordinary pace. At home, the war had tested the nation's unity. The government's use of propaganda, censorship, and surveillance raised difficult questions about freedom and dissent. Many Americans accepted these measures as necessary during wartime, but the experience left behind unease about how easily civil liberties could be restricted in moments of fear. Veterans returned carrying memories that words often failed to capture. Some struggled with physical injuries. Others bore psychological wounds that were poorly understood at the time. Communities worked to honor their service, yet many veterans found it difficult to resume ordinary life. Their experiences became part of a shared national memory, shaping how future generations understood war. The social changes accelerated by the conflict did not fade away. Women who had worked in factories, offices, and farms during the war pushed for lasting recognition of their contributions. Their efforts helped strengthen movements for political and social rights. African American soldiers, who had served in segregated units and often faced discrimination abroad and at home, returned determined to challenge injustice more directly. The war had exposed contradictions between democratic ideals and social realities. Internationally, the consequences were even more complex. The collapse of old empires created new nations, but many borders were unstable and contested. Economic hardship and unresolved grievances left societies vulnerable to extremism and unrest. The peace, shaped in haste and compromise, struggled to deliver the stability many had hoped for. America's choice to step back from formal international commitments reflected deep uncertainty. Many citizens believed that avoiding alliances would protect the nation from future conflicts. Yet the United States could not fully retreat from global influence. Its economy, diplomacy, and military strength continued to shape international events, even when leaders claimed otherwise. In the years that followed, the memory of World War I served as both a warning and a lesson. It demonstrated how quickly local tensions could escalate into global catastrophe. It also showed how decisive intervention, at the right moment, could change the course of history. These lessons would resurface repeatedly as the world moved toward new crises. When historians look back on America's entry into World War I, they often focus on the moment of decision in 1917. Yet the true significance lies not only in that choice, but in what followed. The war forced the United States to confront its growing power and the responsibilities that came with it. It marked the beginning of a long and often uneasy relationship with global leadership. The men who crossed the Atlantic in uniform could not have known how deeply their service would shape the future. They fought in muddy fields and shattered forests, driven by orders they only partly understood. Yet their presence helped bring an end to a war that had consumed millions of lives. Their contribution shifted the balance at a critical moment, turning exhaustion into momentum. World War I did not provide simple answers or lasting peace. But it did mark a turning point. The United States emerged changed, no longer a nation defined solely by distance from the world's conflicts, but one whose actions could influence their outcome. The tide that turned in 1917 carried America forward into a new and uncertain century. As the years passed, memories of the Great War slowly shifted from immediate pain to historical reflection. Monuments were built in towns and cities across the United States, bearing the names of those who never returned. Annual ceremonies honored their sacrifice, even as daily life moved forward. For many Americans, World War I became something remembered rather than lived, yet its influence remained quietly present. The war had shown that industrial power could be as decisive as battlefield bravery. Factories, railroads, shipyards, and farms had become weapons in their own right. This understanding changed how nations prepared for conflict. Future wars would not be decided solely by generals and soldiers, but by entire societies mobilized for struggle. Politically, the war reshaped how Americans viewed leadership and responsibility. The decision to intervene in 1917 stood as proof that isolation could not always guarantee safety. At the same time, the hesitation to remain deeply involved in post-war global structures revealed a nation still uncertain about its role. This tension between engagement and withdrawal would define American foreign policy for decades. Culturally, the war marked the end of an era. Old beliefs in progress and inevitable peace were shaken. Writers, artists, and thinkers grappled with the reality that modern civilization could produce destruction on an unimaginable scale. The optimism of the early 20th century gave way to a more cautious, questioning outlook. For the soldiers who served, the war remained personal. They remembered the sound of shells, the weight of equipment, the fear and camaraderie of the trenches. Many rarely spoke of their experiences. Others shared their stories so that future generations might understand the cost of war. Their voices became part of the nation's historical conscience. The United States did not emerge from World War I as a flawless hero or a permanent peacekeeper. It emerged as a nation awakened to its influence. Its entry into the war did not solve all problems, nor did it prevent future conflict. But at a critical moment, when exhaustion threatened collapse, American intervention altered the direction of history. The turning of the tide in 1917 was not a single battle or decision. It was the result of economic strength, political resolve, and human sacrifice converging at the right time. It demonstrated how quickly the balance of a global conflict could shift when new forces entered the struggle. World War I ended more than a century ago, yet its lessons remain relevant. It reminds us that distance does not equal immunity, that neutrality has limits, and that choices made under pressure can shape generations to come. America's entry into the war stands as a moment when the nation stepped beyond observation and accepted the consequences of action. The guns fell silent in November 1918, but the echoes continued to shape the world. From the ruins of the old order emerged new realities, new responsibilities, and new challenges. The United States, forever changed by its decision, carried those echoes forward into the modern age. In that sense, America's entry into World War I was not merely the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of a new chapter in global history, one in which the nation would never again stand entirely apart from the fate of the world. Time continued to move forward, carrying the world away from the battlefields of France and Belgium, yet never fully escaping their influence. The Great War had carved a deep line through history, dividing an earlier age of confidence from a future marked by uncertainty. For the United States, the experience became a reference point, a reminder of how quickly the nation could be drawn into events far beyond its shores. In the decades that followed, American leaders often looked back to 1917 when faced with difficult choices. The memory of entering the war late but decisively shaped strategic thinking. It reinforced the belief that timing mattered, that waiting too long carried its own dangers, and that overwhelming strength, once committed, could shorten conflicts and save lives in the long run. The soldiers who had fought under the banner of the American Expeditionary Forces grew older. Their uniforms were folded away, their medals stored in drawers, but their stories endured. Some became teachers, workers, farmers, and parents. Others remained marked by what they had seen. Together, they formed a generation shaped by trenches, artillery fire, and the sudden weight of responsibility placed upon a young nation. As the 20th century unfolded, new crises emerged. Old alliances shifted. New threats appeared. The world struggled, again and again, to maintain peace. Each time, the shadow of World War I lingered in the background, a reminder of the cost of failure and the price of delay. America's role continued to evolve. Though it had stepped back from formal global leadership after the war, its economic power and cultural influence expanded. Trade, finance, and diplomacy tied the nation ever more closely to events overseas. The distance that once seemed protective grew less meaningful in an interconnected world. Looking back, it becomes clear that America's entry into World War I was not simply a reaction to submarine attacks or diplomatic provocations. It was the moment when the United States crossed a threshold. It accepted that its ideals, interests, and security were bound to the wider world. That realization would shape every major conflict that followed. The turning of the tide in 1917 was therefore more than a military shift. It was a transformation of identity. The United States emerged from the war aware of its capacity to influence history, for better or worse. The challenge from that point forward was how to wield that influence wisely. The Great War did not provide a final answer to that challenge. It offered a lesson, written in sacrifice and loss, that power carried responsibility and that isolation was never absolute. The United States had learned this lesson at great cost, and the world would continue to test whether it had learned it well. As the echoes of the war faded into history, one truth remained clear. When America entered World War I, it changed the course of the conflict and the direction of its own future. The decision taken in 1917 did not end war forever, but it did mark the moment when the United States stepped fully onto the world stage. From that moment on, the nation would never again be merely a spectator to global events. The tide had turned, and with it, history itself.